Welcome to Revolution 913. On behalf of both the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought at Columbia University and the Institute for Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Institute for Social Research and to this session of Revolution 1313. I'm delighted to co-host this session with Martin Zarr, a dear friend and colleague and longtime 1313 interlocutor. I think this is our fourth seminar here at the Institute, co-hosting. As you know, Martin Zarr is professor of social philosophy here at Goethe Universität Frankfurt, holding the chair that was previously held by Habermas and Axel Honneth, and that I think Horkheimer held for a short period of time here. And he's the author of several books at the intersection of many of these issues that we'll be talking about today, including Genealogy as Critique, which focuses on Nietzsche and Foucault, and The Immanence of Power, Political Theory After Spinoza. I couldn't think of a better interlocutor for these questions on the history of critique and praxis of critical theory. And we're also joined in the room by Herman Kochiba, who I'll introduce in a moment, and others. And so it's wonderful to be here in person. Now, I'll dispense with the usual stage setting at this point, because I imagine that anyone who is here knows who Hans-Jürgen Krahl was and what the German SDS student movement was about. And if you need a refresher, please just read the introduction that's on the blog. I think we can jump over the usual framing, but I don't think we can sidestep the moment right now and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so I think we should start there. We live in deeply turbulent times, coming out of a pandemic, hopefully, and now beset with a new war by the Russians in Ukraine. The connection to Hans-Jürgen Krahl, I think, is very tight here, particularly because of his essay in the New Left Review on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And he saw a paradox, you'll recall, in that invasion, which was the fact that the reformers and those who were participating in the Prague Spring turned to liberal political theoretic models of civil and political rights, in a way turning back to Bruno Bauer, possibly, as opposed to the Marx of the Jewish question. Although he saw this paradox, he also saw that this was a hopeful moment for him and the SDS movement. And he saw the possibility of transformation in the paradoxical inversion of kind of superstructure and infrastructure at that moment that he diagnosed. That is a real connection to our moment, because the situation feels almost identical in many ways today to the invasion of Czechoslovakia at the time in 1969. And the only, I mean, well, it's not the Soviet Union, it's Russia, of course, but the similar expectation that there would be no response by the United States, the similar expectation that the United Nations couldn't do anything. The only difference, of course, is that what's missing is communism. And that, I think, is a key in the moment and something that we can talk about in terms of Krahl's thinking, but also in terms of our moment. If anything, it's key because it underscores, in a way, the way in which the purported ideological struggle between capitalism and communism at the time was perhaps an illusion that masked the true conflict of two geopolitical spheres of influence. Now, there's no longer that conflict in political economy, both countries being deeply steeped in forms of capitalism. And that, of course, makes it a very different time and a very different conjuncture for us to think about critical theory and praxis. It also raises interesting questions about where is there movement towards change. At the time, Marcuse, actually in one of his letters to Adorno, made this interesting comment that it was the student movement and the student movement alone that represented the opportunity for change even though he said, this is Marcuse writing, I never voiced the nonsensical opinion that the student movement is itself revolutionary, but it is the strongest, perhaps the only catalyst for transformation. And so the question, of course, today is how should we think about that in the conjuncture and in the historical conjuncture today, relying on Krahl and the SDS movement, but also, I think, and we'll talk about this, thinking a lot about Angela Davis and the abolitionist feminism that she is developing, in part because perhaps the student movement today is displaced, at least in the United States, by the movement for Black lives that has become, I think, in Marcuse's terms, the strongest, perhaps the only catalyst for social change today. So we'll be discussing Krahl, we'll be discussing Angela Davis, and just maybe let me throw out one provocative idea. We're going to be thinking a lot of the direction that the Frankfurt School would have taken or could have taken, or an alternative path that was represented by Hans-Jürgen Krahl and others. And in part, I think maybe we need to also situate Angela Davis on that alternative path. It was cut short, of course, by Krahl's untimely death at the age of 27 in 1970. But we did see where Angela Davis took her thought, abolition feminism today. And it's possible that we could actually think of her development, and I tried to spell this out in a post on the blog, as actually representing a more faithful spirit of a second generation of the Frankfurt School in relationship to the question of critique and praxis than the other philosophers that we sometimes place in that role. And so maybe later on, but as the first initial provocation, I'll suggest that maybe it's Angela Davis and abolition feminism that represents the true second generation of the Frankfurt School, or alternatively, that Adorno and Marcuse are the stepping stones for abolition feminism today. All right, but let me not get ahead of myself. And I want to ask others, and I want Martin to intervene, but I do want to say that we're joined today in the room by Hermann Koshiba, who was a comrade of Krahl and bridges the Frankfurt-Paris divide, one of the most famous translators of Foucault's work, as well as Eval, Deleuze, Bourdieu, and has been a researcher here at the Institute for Social Research for over 40 years on the sociology of labor. We're also joined on Zoom by the editors of the Viewpoint magazine dossier on Krahl, so Elia Zaru, Fabio Angelelli, and Dave Messing, who, as you know, did an extraordinary job putting together an English dossier of Krahl's work. We're also joined on Zoom by Massimiliano Tomba, a dear friend and colleague who contributed an important essay on that dossier. And we have in the room people also who have worked in the archives, Fabien Myers, who is a student at the EHESS and who's worked on the Krahl archives, and Sarah Bianchi, who is in the thick of these questions. So I just want to acknowledge the wealth of kind of intellectual resources that we have here. And I want to give a special thanks to Fonda Shen and Louis Hufnagel on the back end. So thank you and welcome all. Martin, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Also, welcome from me. Hello, New York. Hello, world. Welcome to Frankfurt and the Institute for Social Research. And when we were thinking, not that long ago, by the way, thinking about doing again one session for 1313, this time on revolution from here, a couple of things crossed our minds. And of course, given the Frankfurt context, given the fact that the both of us understand ourselves as critical theorists, sometimes with a capital C and a capital T, sometimes with a smaller c and a smaller t, of course, it made sense rethinking what revolution, the very idea, the concept, and maybe the project or the goal could mean to critical theory in the local, let's say, that means Frankfurt sense. And we could have discussed Benjamin, maybe, half Frankfurter, half Berliner, of course. We could have interpreted again Marcuse, maybe the most revolutionary of the canonical thinkers of the Frankfurt School, even if he was, of course, at the time when he was in a way systematically thinking this through, not in Frankfurt, not even in Germany anymore. But it came to my mind that we should talk about HansJrgen Krahl, so one of the, let's say, important mythical, legendary figures in that history, also in that institutional history, because he was one of the people behind the famous Besetzung, the occupation of the institute, and its infamous aftermath. And because he stands for something that is present in that tradition and in that theoretical history, but that sometimes is forgotten, omitted, sometimes even repressed. So he's not one of the canonical thinkers. He has not left many writings that, in a way, have stood the test of time, but still he is a symptom and a symbol of something, namely the very idea that the readers of the first generation of the Frankfurt School in the 1960s obviously clearly thought that there would be an almost direct link between that form of critique of society or theory of society and the project of revolution. And the SDS movement, comprised of many, many students all over Germany, but in a way with a focus on Heidelberg, Frankfurt and Berlin at the time, many of them were extremely strongly influenced by the writings of also Habermas, but of course mainly Horkheimer and Adorno. And for them it was clear that the older generation didn't dare to spell out how revolutionary this theoretical outlook still is. And of course, at the time, both of them were, let's say, old, established figures. So rebelling against those critical theories also had something of a generational conflict. And Krahl might be the most important and also the most visible figure, drawing lessons from the work of Horkheimer and mainly Adorno, that in a way were highlighting the revolutionary potential in that very tradition, even against the authors themselves, and mainly against Adorno, who at the time, of course, had also a different role, being, let's say, a well-established academic, also a well-established public intellectual, but also an institutional figure, so someone who had to also think about the whole institutional setup not collapsing. And the SDS, in its most radical moment, of course, was toying with the idea that everything should be blown up to create something completely new. And if you read Krahl, maybe for the first time, also now in these English translations, you will see that this is a very heated form of discourse. It's pretty full of pathos and affect and emotion. And it's full of very dry abstraction. So it, in a way, also breathes the air and the spirit of, let's say, neo-Marxist dogmatism of the time. And it's also a pretty abstract form of writing, making it difficult to understand, at least reading it for the first, the second, and the third time. But one can also see the almost existential drasticness and seriousness of that thinking, because this is someone who in 1967, 68, 69 tries to think through a political, historical, and social moment and trying to develop something like a critical perspective on the very social condition and historical moments of the time, and claiming that with the toolbox of, let's say, neo-Marxist theory from Korsch to Lukács to Adorno, and a certain conception of history and a certain idea about political agency and class consciousness, you could gain something like a wedge to be driven into the stale stability of the Western German political conditions of the time. And Krahl himself became a cult or a legendary figure at the time, not only because he died with 27, but that definitely also made him something like a real mythical figure, because it's like a promise of a life work and also a political efficiency that he, in a way, could never experience himself. But he was, let's say, a political leader in a kind of political movement that, in a way, was defying leadership. And that kind of gauchismo or leftism that the SDS was standing for, and exactly that Krahl within the SDS was standing for, still has the name, and deservedly so, of anti-authoritarian leftism. And therefore, it's an interesting mix, maybe even a tension between a still little bit vanguardist movement claiming you have to have a certain theoretical stance from which also to educate the masses, let's say, so there's a slight Leninist element in it. But at the same time, Krahl, differently to many, many others, also of the other SDS protagonists, and he had a couple of enemies within the movement, so to say, was insisting on the anti and non-authoritarian nature of that kind of political teaching or education that was needed. And of course, this had some implications for the, at the time, you might recall also the French debates on this, the difficult relationship between the students or the intellectuals on the one hand, the proletarians and the workers on the other side. And he was also trying to work hard on some kind of, let's say, inner movement mediation between these two roles and these two poles. But the anti-authoritarian side of it, we might call it, by the way, democratic maybe in hindsight, was strong. So Krahl was not thinking that there could be something like a vanguard or avant-garde theory that would be true and objective and then only had to be applied to the very historical subjects that were to be its media. But he thought that this would have to be something like a communicative, interactive, dynamic relationship in which theoretical developments and political action inform and correct itself in some kind of dialectic between theory and praxis. And he thought that the university could be the place where at least the theoretical side of this could be developed and even experimented with, but would then have to be complemented by direct political action, also involving proletarian involvement and proletarian action itself. So these were people that also worked in the factories and trying to raise consciousness among workers also here in the Rhine-Main area. So it was clear that the students themselves, as part of, let's say, the more or less dominant classes, even if they're petty bourgeois, could play a role, and Krahl himself was claiming to be a class trader in that. But this is not an easy relationship between someone who teaches and someone who receives the teaching, but this would have to be some kind of dialectical process in which also the practical side or the praxis itself would have some kind of primacy. So we have an unorthodox thinking of political action as something that is not exempt from or completely distant to theory, that is not only informed by theory, but that in itself becomes something like a theoretical factor within praxis. Pretty interesting and typically Frankfurt School kind of thought. But Krahl was also insisting that the real or right political or philosophical doctrine would be worth nothing without its realization and without its activist or practical side. And this exactly was the point of departure between him and his teacher Adorno, who, as you might recall, in his late writings from the late 1960s, and the negative dialectics, of course, is in a way the high point of that kind of, it's not quietism and it's not pessimism and not resignation, but some kind of abstinence from direct action and political involvement. And the famous, one of the very last essays called Resignation, is trying to say this might look like resignation, but it's nothing else than realism, given that the political and historical conditions are such that, and this is almost a quote, political action is impossible. And this, of course, ties in with the Zeitdiagnose and the historical diagnosis of the late Adorno, that late modernity and late capitalism especially has created some kind of Verblendungszusammenhang that is so hard to grasp and even harder to dispel, that to think that through direct political action you could get rid of it, and this would be the old idea of revolution, would be futile, even puerile. And Krahl was embodying exactly that ambition, that if you mix a certain conception of class consciousness, a certain diagnosis of late capitalism that he took from Horkheimer mainly, and if you mix it with a certain conception of the classes teaching themselves how they could get out of their dominated positions, you would have something like a critical practice consonant with critical theory, and in which the step towards praxis or practical activity, spontaneous and planned action, would be indispensable, not impossible, but necessary. And of course, this was the antithesis to Adorno's stance, at least in the direct political consequences. If you look at the historical documents, also the TV material, you can see that on many, many occasions, Adorno appeared next to Krahl, next to Nick, and next to many, many other people from the SDS, because in the concrete political issues, like the Notstandsgesetze, for example, or the demonstration against the murder of Ohne Sorg, they, of course, were on the same page. And of course, Adorno also endorsed most of the more moderate goals of the student movement at the time, namely denazification of German historical consciousness, getting rid of, let's say, repressive authoritarian structures within the institutions, within public life, and also within the economy. And of course, something like what we might call maybe emancipatory democratization of society as a whole. This is nothing but what the SDS also wanted and what, of course, Adorno was endorsing. But he thought that this doesn't mean that you could join a movement that claims to overthrow the whole system, or that claims to overthrow, let's say, state structures and transgress, and this was the main point, legal borders. And the occupation of the Institute for Social Research at that time, in a way, for him was this one breach of protocol and breach of rules, in which, that's what Adorno thought, the one step towards barbarism and spontaneous action that looks exactly like the thing it is trying to fight against is too small and too dangerous and too risky. And in that diagnosis or diagnostic point, he and Krahl were on opposite sides. So what might be of interest to us today reading Krahl? And I already said reading his primary work is not that easy. So just to have a look at this. So the Frankfurt Library still holds these things in their originals. And this is the main work in its edited form. This is a new volume. Hermann Kochebai is also in it, edited by young people who at the moment make a strong argument for rereading Krahl. Why? It could be 4 points. The first would be Krahl, as by the way, the early Habermas, and the SDS also as a historical symptom, were crucial for posing the question of the status of the university, the intellectuals and the students. So what does it mean to inhabit a place where you can learn, study, develop theoretical positions without being already implicated within, let's say, the ordinary or regular division of labor? And Krahl seems to say it's no coincidence that in Frankfurt, as in Paris, a certain kind of emancipatory desire was generated within the university, because these are young people with a little bit of free time and, let's say, freedom from specific pressures of life's necessities, and with a whole history, an archive of revolutionary and emancipatory theories and materials at their disposal. So there is something to be said about the freedom of the university and university life, in a way, being prone to being a site for the origin of emancipatory theorizing and also practical perspectives. And Krahl and the SDS were trying hard to think through that very freedom and separateness of the university as a space, together with the conjunction with the other classes that don't have the freedom to think and to learn and to study, but they have to work in the factories and reproduce the necessities of social life. And the idea what this could mean to think the link and also the possible alliances between, let's say, knowledge work and the other forms of work, this is something that Krahl and the SDS are thinking through extremely thoroughly. And I think it could be important at a moment when most university systems experience some kind of crisis, and when the production of knowledge undergoes some kind of delegitimation. This is something that seems to hold true for almost all societies globally. And when we see new revolts and new rebellions against, let's say, the instrumentalization of knowledge or the also economization of knowledge, think of Chile at the moment, one might think that this is a Baustelle, a theme that we as critical theorists cannot not think. So thinking the institutions of theory, inquiry, research, and learning in their connection to the other social spheres. And for me, some of the writings of the SDS and some of the also pretty difficult and sometimes a little bit tortured debates of the time pose that question of the status of the student and the university in a seriousness that to me seems unparalleled in any other political doctrine from the left in the 20th century. The second point is that Krahl, also against Horkheimer and against Adorno, was insisting on the irreducibility of the class question for critical theory. In that, of course, he was, like many other of his generation, more orthodoxly Marxist than Adorno and Horkheimer himself. And he was insisting on the fact that, working also with some elements of the theory of Lukács, the question of class consciousness has to be center stage for any movement that tries to at least prepare something like a radical transformation of societies, even if it means updating the classical Marxian notion of class structures and the idea of a dualism between two main classes. And one might say that some of the major contributions Krahl himself made are concerning this kind of modification or actualization of class theory. And in this, by the way, he is also highly in tune with other theoretical moments of the time, and the Italian workerist, operaistische tradition, of course, they were reading Krahl and the other way around, in a way might be the other, seen from a European angle, might be the other moment in which this kind of topic gained center stage again after some time in which it was not forgotten, but at least kind of put to the side. And Adorno, of course, has to be blamed for that, because he seemed to think, at least in the late 1960s, some Adorno readers might prove me wrong, at least he seemed to think that the classical class analysis of Marx might not lead us anywhere, because the social structure of late capitalist societies has a completely different form and function and coherence. And this also has to do with the Verblendungszusammenhangs thesis and some other elements in his, let's say, social theory from the 1950s and 60s. But Krahl here was insisting on the necessity of the preparation and also the mobilization of class consciousness and the regaining of a certain conception of, however actualized, class analysis. The third point is, of course, the trope of the connection between theory and praxis. I already said something about this, and Bernard has written on this beautifully in his introduction. And this just means the fact that for a critical theory to think itself without praxis is a mistake, to think about praxis without theory is also a mistake. So Krahl himself was warring or struggling, of course, also with tendencies at the time that gained some prominence again in the 1970s in Germany from the more spontaneist, the so-called Sponti movement, in which a certain kind of leftist politics was thought of as almost immediate spontaneous action that is not mediated through a larger also sociological diagnosis. Whereas in Krahl, he's really insisting on a, let's say, functioning dialectical relationship between theory and praxis. And this is something that is also a challenge to us today who think of ourselves as critical theorists without sometimes being too optimistic about prescribing, even dreaming of possible forms of praxis. And of course, I have to look at Bernard here because he, in his own work and in his own life, is also trying to achieve some kind of Vermittlung, even Versöhnung here. The fourth point, and then I'll stop, has to do with that, and it has a specific name, and it had a specific name in the debates of the time, and this is the so-called infamous Organisationsfrage. This was a also the title of a famous intervention at one of the SDS meetings that Krahl had prepared together with Dutschke. And the Organisationsfrage at that time refers to the question that Lukács might have termed tactical, namely the question, what forms of institutions or quasi-institutions and what degrees of formalization does a transformative movement need? And is the SDS something like a revolutionary party? And if not, what else? And the idea that organizing or preparing, starting transformation needs some degree of coherence, preparation, and also tactical savviness was clear to everyone who didn't want to stop at wild strikes in the university. This is how the SDS and the student movement in its revolt kind of phase in 67 had started. But the SDS was trying to transform or to translate these forms of actions that were highly successful at the time into something more stable, more durable, and also more teleological, let's say, goal-oriented. And Krahl here was thinking something like, Adorno is halfway right, that a communist dream or project does not need a fully painted out, a fully fleshed out image or vision or build of what the liberated society would look like. But there has to be something about, let's say, the transformative steps in between. And these transformative steps for Krahl and for the SDS and many, many others were tied to a specific conception of what kind of collective organized action would be needed and what kind of Organisationsstrukturen or institutional designs these movements would need. And again, this ties up with the question of anti-authoritarianism. It's clear that this is not the teaching of the master or the expert who teaches the others what to do, but this has to be something, again, a dialectical process in which people involved, participants in transformation, also are informed by certain conceptions, certain recipes, one might say, strategies of transformation, but there has to be something, a space in which these also more theoretical issues are cast out and then developed. And the SDS as a non-party, but also not just an informal movement, was trying to be something like that platform that has a certain structure or Organisationsform that is not not formless, but does not, in a way, turn into an authoritarian, more or less Leninist kind of apparatus or machine. It's hard to tell, and I could not tell, if Dutschke and Krahl arrived at a solution or if they had a clear-cut idea that we could just use and say, look, it's here. So this has to be a movement that's not a party, but not only a movement. But for me, this is the precise posing of a question and a problem that also, if I might say so, in my and our generations, sometimes are lost. Some of us are members of political parties, but reluctantly so, because we don't believe in political parties anymore. Or not really. We think this is necessary, and sometimes we join. But in a way, we don't buy into political parties being the main motors of transformative processes anymore. Many of us endorse social movements, but we only like them when they are not too strict and, let's say, too organized. So we like initiatives and protest movements, but we don't like them turning into, let's say, organized political actors. Some of us do, of course. So we can talk about Syriza and many, many other cases. But in a way, our generation has a certain deep suspicion towards the party form, has a deep sympathy for social movements. But in a way, Krahl and also Dutschke thought there must be something in between. There must be something like a more highly organized, institutionalized form of political action that is more than movement, but less petrified and less stabilized than party. And it could be that also for democratic theory of the present, this might be a place to look and think about, also when we think of how not to make revolution today, but how to think about and make change. And it could be that Krahl might be an indispensable interlocutor for these questions.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to pick up on a few things, but then I want to turn the table to Herman Kuchiba to really give us some thoughts from back then. But just to pick up on the last thing that you were suggesting, which was this question of anti-authoritarianism today, in a way. So the question is really interesting, which is, to what extent do critical movements today have and embrace a notion of anti-authoritarianism or anti-authoritarianism that was very strong at the time? And I think you do see it very much reflected in many of the movements towards leaderlessness in contemporary movements, which seems to be one of the, well, certain forms of movements. At least it was true with Occupy and Nuit Debout and others, and the abolitionist, the new abolitionist movement in the United States. And so there is a question, an interesting question of how that is experienced today, probably differently, and maybe less so than in the 19th, but in a different way, perhaps. I mean, and the question, and one way of reframing the question is to try and figure out what it is in Krahl's work and in the work of the SDS movement that could provide a way forward, could have provided a way forward at the time, could provide a way forward today. And in thinking about that, I think that it's really necessary to understand the subsequent translation history of Krahl's work, right? Because his work gets translated immediately into Italian and becomes part of the workerist movement there. Is not translated into French. There's an ongoing collective right now that's translating it into French. Has never been translated into English. And I think that that's actually very important in terms of understanding what the potential was, because that anti-authoritarianism translated most, I think, into a form of workerism, which was not engaged with the party, not engaged with other forms of kind of traditional organization, but was involved with workers figuring it out themselves. In other words, and which of course creates this tension, I think, with Krahl's work, because of there is an element of vanguardism in Krahl's writings, talking about intellectuals that have to use their knowledge in service of class struggles, political intellectuals, etc. There is that element which is in tension with the more workerist side, and then of course, you know, three other elements to throw in the mix is this notion of non-compromise, which I think is really important, and that's one of the things at the beginning of this of the essay, of the introductory essay, that one of the things that the revolutionary thinkers provided, according to Hans-Jürgen Krahl, was a political morality that rejects compromise. Of course, now then, how does that play out? Is it purely historically situated because of the Soviet Union and the fact that the Soviet Union had embraced a kind of a realpolitik that had basically given up on revolutionary change in Western countries like Germany? Or is there something about that non-compromise that is related to the forms of praxis that Krahl would be involved with? Was it, and is it something, the non-compromise, that comes from the anti-colonial struggles that were ongoing and that were not really a part of the, that was not really a part of the critical theory conversation necessarily as much then as it would become later? And so how to think about non-compromise in the context of anti-authoritarian thinking that focuses then on what the persons situated at the nexus of work or the university or education are trying to achieve. And of course, to do that very cognizant of the historical conjuncture at the time, and of course, a very different historical conjuncture today. But Herman, let me ask, and maybe we can pass the mic that's on the table over there down for Herman to intervene and perhaps shed some light or further the interpretation.
Well, I learned about the Organisationsreferat of Dutschke and Krahl only quite late. It was after the death of Hans-Jürgen Krahl, and it was some mythological text. And when it was found, then, well, it's astonishing the way of expectations of a revolutionary situation seen from today. But on the other side, it was well, an effort to give a new idea of the left, integrating struggle in the third world, integrating American protest against war in Vietnam. There were people I knew here from the SDS, like Helmut Reinecke, who also wrote an article on Krahl, the book. He was engaged in campaigns in the southern states of the United States in order to arrive at registration and supporting voting rights of Afro-American people, for instance. And that was also a topic discussed here in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was a place where you could meet a lot of Americans, also American soldiers, for instance. They did not directly want to go to Vietnam, and well, we organized some ways how to avoid this way. And well, it was an idea how to integrate very different perspectives and new ideas on emancipation, because, well, anti-authoritarianism was not just the idea that was represented by the German workers' movement. And in the time when I learned, was acquainted with Krahl personally, there was a phase where some retraditionalization of the left took place. People now not only reading Lukács, but interpreting in a quite limited Leninist way, and they were saying, well, adequate consciousness of the world situation is only possible from the perspective of the proletariat, and students are only welcome as some sort of supporters. And in this situation, well, it was a challenge to Krahl to reformulate class theory. I would say it was not the point that he said, well, we have to rely on class instead of other analytical conceptions, but to have an idea of class, not interpreting intellectuals as some sort of ally, but to look whether intellectuals have undergone a certain transformation where they become part of the surplus generating collective, and which are the results from this transformation for also developing political strategies. And I think Krahl was not at a point where he said, well, we have arrived at some good propositions how to start successfully protest movements, and we want to export it now to other countries and other places. No, it was a situation where it was necessary to start again on some basic reflection, because he saw it as a challenge, this Leninization of the left, and it was quite a dominant strand in the early, became it in the early 70s. And there were some people who expected, who have told if Krahl would have survived and if Dutschke were not shot, then there would have been a chance for developing of this anti-authoritarian form of Marxism. I'm not very sure whether it's just a question of two incidents of, but I would say Krahl tried to come back to certain motives of critical theory in order to to arrive at a transformation of Marxism. And it was this process that was stopped. And he, as you mentioned, he had to fight against certain tendencies within the left, people who were really tired of having to read theories, having speculative debates of, well, they wanted to have concrete experiences. And this Sponti scene here in Frankfurt was, at the one side, relying a little bit on Krahl against this dogmatism, but on the other side, they did not, they like to continue this way of emancipation via reflecting the atrocities of the present society. Because, well, we have to find some way out without this way of going to the cold abstraction as proposed from Adorno. And well, that was a division here in Frankfurt, and the spontaneist movement, one can roughly say, well, it was milieu which gave rise also to the successful left ecological movement here. But as I see it now, there are young people who think it's time to think about theoretical concepts behind. And I think this causes a new interest in Krahl, and also in seeing what was the internal relation between Krahl and certain motives within critical theory. And I think it was especially, as you mentioned, Horkheimer and Adorno, but I was quite surprised when I heard some earlier interviews and speeches of Krahl, where he seems sometimes quite close also to the rhetoric of Habermas, well, he tried to take advantage of different lines of argument within the whole Frankfurt spectrum, and in order to put it into political reflection. But that was a risky strategy. It was conflict with Adorno and with Habermas quite early and more radical. And it was a problem also with the majority of the leftist movement, because as I said, it was not a very popular way of thinking, and people who liked a little bit to rely on theoretical concepts, they used to have very simple readings of Marx here, also in Frankfurt. Well, it was a narrowing of the perspective, and it's quite astonishing for me to see which were the debates at the times in the late 60s, because they were not continued. That's not Frankfurt here, in a sense that we were always on the level of reflection realized by HansJrgen Krahl. It's a continent who disappeared a little bit, and perhaps we can make some discoveries, but
yeah, and that notion of disappearance is important in terms of, well, disappearance from certain conversations, perhaps, reappearance in terms of the publication in the Italian conversation, right? So maybe a shift from Germany to Italy, where I think there was a flourishing interest and use of, and familiarity with and engagement with Krahl's thinking and that anti-authoritarian strand. Not in France, in part, I think, because there was more of an engagement with Maoist thought at the time, and it's possible that we could draw some parallels between an anti-authoritarian approach that turns into workerism in Italy, or that gets picked up actually by a long time movement, whereas in France there was more of a shift towards integrating forms of, or at least an engagement with Maoist thinkers more. So a movement to Italy and to that debate over forms of praxis. Of course, at the same time, historically, the emergence of more armed factions, both in Germany and in Italy, which then creates some discord within the German left and also within the Italian left. But this gives us the opportunity then to think actually about about Angela Davis's role in here, because and in this fascinating interview Angela Davis gave in 2020, she, in part in response to the question, she kind of focuses on some of the ways in which dwelling within contradictions, she says, kind of the productivity of dwelling within contradictions and the impact that that had on her in terms of her own praxis of ultimately joining the Communist Party, then leaving the American Communist Party, and then going to the Black Panther Party, and then her later development of abolitionism in the 90s, and now the work on abolition feminism and the new book with Gina Dent and Beth Ritchie and others on called Abolition Feminism Now. She actually traces a seed back to the contradictions that she experienced in the late 1960s here at Frankfurt. between the students and Adorno, also between Adorno and Marcuse. And I thought that was particularly interesting because there, of course, is a trajectory that we know and we can trace, right? In a way, we don't have the trajectory that that Krahl and the other SDS students could have traced, because there was that moment where it kind of falls out of the conversation. But we do have that with Angela Davis, and there's this way in which she says that, she says in her conversation, the capacity to dwell within contradictions and render them productive is an important element of feminist methodologies. I'm recognizing now that I had encountered dilemmas that required that insight in the late 1960s when I was studying with Adorno. And of course, as everyone knows, she was here for 2 years in the mid 60s and was going to write her doctoral dissertation with Adorno, but felt the urge to go back to the United States because of the political struggles there, and ultimately worked with Marcuse at San Diego, and eventually writes a dissertation on Kant. But here's what's interesting, of course, the contradictions that she speaks about in terms of the contradictions between Adorno and Marcuse, and also Adorno and the students. But the other contradiction, that actually Adorno was the one who was providing the concepts that the students were drawing on, or represented the theoretical element that allowed for thinking about critique and praxis, right? That too is a deep contradiction in here, both because Adorno is the figure, of course, against whom the students rebel at one point, but is also the figure who was a source of theoretical emancipation and of so much of the theoretical frameworks that they were using, right? So these contradictions she talks about as being so important and maybe not formative. I mean, so, and Angela Davis has had such an extraordinary critique and praxis over her life. I wouldn't want to, suggest any kinds of appropriations or anything like that. But I think that it's interesting to think about the continuity from that moment when she was here in Frankfurt to the present, to feminist abolitionist methods. In that interview, she kind of sees something that she hadn't thought of before. She said, although I didn't see myself as learning how to work within the context of contradictions, this is precisely what I was attempting to do. When I joined the Communist Party, I was extremely critical of a number of issues related to the party. However, based on the experience I had in Frankfurt, I realized that it was possible to be engaged and active while simultaneously remaining critical. And she tries to show the continuity then to her contemporary critique and praxis, which I think is particularly interesting, and suggests that maybe we could actually look there to see how some of these ideas that were being formulated actually did play out in a way, So I mean, the most provocative claim here would be that Angela Davis represents the second generation here of the Frankfurt School, or the other way around, inversely, or Frankfurt School was a stepping stone towards that. That would be, of course, another genealogy, but also another way of trying to bring the Krahl and SDS movement into conversation with today, with our thoughts about critique and praxis today. So I wanted to, throw that out as another way to think about this work.
No, I can see the line we might take. And one might say that when she talks about, let's say, the philosophical formation in Frankfurt, this also has to do with the idea that philosophical work is also something like an exercise, learning to bear complexity and contradiction. And from all that we know of Adorno's teaching, and many of you might know, there has been a lot of research now into Adorno's own seminar and teaching Praxis. And Dirk Braunstein, who's working here at the Institute, is editing the protocols and the referate from the seminars. And this is a huge, monumental archival work. But in there, you can see how Adorno seemed to have succeeded in conveying the sense that playing the philosophical game also in the classroom is no Glasperlenspiel, no end in itself, even if it looks like it, and it has its own rules and its own formulas and registers, but that in the end, learning to do philosophy or dialectical thinking is also something that deeply has to do with the social reality to which it speaks or in which it happens. And I think Angela Davis is trying to say something like that. It's not that simple thing. I learned that the world is complicated in Frankfurt, and then in the US I could apply that thought. That would be silly. But it's a version of that thought that for Adorno, dialectics or philosophy, that for him was the same thing, is the art of coming to grips with contradictions and contradictory forces in thinking, knowing that the social realities to which the thoughts or the ideas refer or even correspond have in a way the same nature or dynamics. And therefore, moving within a dialectical or negatively thought of dialectical system is also a way of finding strategies, tactics of dealing with social contradictions. And it could be that Krahl, in a way, was just saying, by the way, we should spell this out, or we should work on that correspondence or reflection, and also now work, at least tentatively so, experimentally so, within a certain kind of organization, on these social contradictions, trying to transform them, maybe mediate them, or at least so accept them as the formative forces within our societies. And he might have said that all these lessons you can learn in following a seminar on the critique of pure reason or the phenomenology of spirit could be applied almost directly to moving in within a complex political situations where you have different actors, different interests, different consciousnesses. And it could be that Angela Davis saw that there is a connection that some of the more political students of Adorno's always also saw, that some of whom took to be a recipe for direct political action. And this is what Adorno was abhorring, because he didn't believe that mere simple deduction. But Krahl, in a way, might have seen that as dialectically as Adorno and just said, you have to play also on the practical or the political register. And then you have to think about forms of political action. This is the Organisationsfrage again, that is doing justice to the contradictory nature also of political circumstances, where there is not the one emancipatory liberatory actor, the proletariat, that you have to just give arms to, and then he will, or she, or it, the agent, will transform the society for the better, but that you have to live with and work with the contradictions between different classes. And there are also contradictory antithetical relationships within each other. And that you then have to find, let's say, a form. This is what I think organization means, a form in which to bear or endure these contradictions. And interestingly, I think, looking back, Adorno provided no imagery for that. So bearing the contradictions of late capitalist society without seeing it as, let's say, a dark hole of Verblendung. Whereas the SDS at least thought, if we factor in, and Hermann, of course, was reminding us that if we factor in the other political struggles at the time, Vietnam, but also the so-called third world struggles, the decolonization movements, then the political picture looks extremely different from the Adornian outlook, which seems very much focused on the German case and its own historical specificity. Whereas the SDS seemed to say, let's open the map and not see less, but even more contradictions, but maybe contradictions that inform each other or that heighten, let's say, the complexity of the whole system that then has to be thought of with the help of a theory that might be even more complex than, let's say, ordinary or classical or even negative dialectics. And this is something I find seductive, I have to say. And also coming back to Davis, we might say this is also something that a couple of years later, and you have dealt with this in other 1313 sessions, of course, was leading to intersectionality as a new paradigm of thinking, let's say, complex layers of society with multiple contradictions, multiple oppressions. And we could also think about the mid-plateau conception of society that was replacing a more simpler dualist, simplified Marxist worldview. So Krahl was also part of these pluralizations or complexifications of left theory that in the world and in the context in which Angela Davis was working later also had pretty clear-cut practical and political implications, and was even producing something like a very effective machinery of social critique, because you could say that intersectionality or intersectional feminism might be, and you seem to imply that already a couple of minutes ago, seemed to be one of the most important social theoretical achievements of the last decades, let's say. It might even take the place of what we thought a theory of society might look like today. And if you imagine Angela Davis and Krahl sharing a beer in some WG in '68, they might have talked about these things, and I would love to imagine that they agreed on these issues.
Yeah. No, there's this terrific interview with Detlef Clausen where he talks about the fact that it was Krahl who brought him. He was only 19 at the time, to the Adorno seminars. I think it was on, I forget which ones these were, but it was Kant. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it was on the critique, she says. But and then that's where Angela Davis met, where he met Angela Davis and where Angela Davis was. So there must have been obviously these fascinating conversations going on at the time. The question that this raises to me is, how is it that the experiences of contradiction, the way in which contradictions are experienced and understood can lead in part, in some of these situations, to praxis, and in others away from praxis. And in our readings, we have, for instance, the correspondence between Adorno and Marcuse, which is fascinating. And there's this really fascinating passage where Adorno writes to Herbert Marcuse in regards to protesting the Vietnam War, and says on bottom of 127 of our correspondence, if that really is your reaction, Herbert, then you should not only protest against the horror of napalm bombs, but also against the unspeakable Chinese-style tortures that the Viet Cong carry out on permanently, right? And so, in a way, it's bringing up the contradiction of that moment of the Vietnam War and the experiences of violence on both sides. And as a result of it, retreating in a way, or being unwilling to take a position on the war in Vietnam, right? And instead to view everything as just, what he calls brutal practicism. Now, and so the question is, how does that experience of finding and living with the contradictions push away from praxis? You in the article, or in the portion of the Constitution and Class Struggle that was translated in Telos under the title "The Political Contradictions in Adorno's Critical Theory," you really have the impression. I mean, it's actually, Florian, we were looking at it last week in the seminar. It's not 280, 285, 288, but it's something else, right, Florian? It was more like 287 when we were looking at the original in the German.
Yes, 293.
293. Okay, yeah. So, and that was translated early on in Telos. But there's this way in which, and it's a very psychologizing interpretation of Adorno, psychologizing critique of Adorno, suggesting that the experience of fascism in some way, made it impossible, and the trauma. It's almost a, in today's terms, it would be a kind of PTSD analysis of what led to Adorno's, according to Krahl, inability to engage in praxis at the time. It was some kind of trauma of fascism, right? Fascism, this trauma that violates the subjectivity of the theoretician and reinforces the class barriers against his cognitive ability, but it irresistibly trapped Adorno in its ruin, right, is what the interpretation is here. But of course, this is a place where it almost sounds as if Krahl is suggesting that the experience of contradictions, and in part it might be that we see in the Vietnam context, leads to a paralysis rather than a movement forward, right? That was at least Krahl's interpretation here, and that raises the question of how can it be productive, not non-resolved in a kind of easy, like we don't move to some synthesis, third stage, living with the contradiction in such a way that it doesn't block praxis. On page 166 of the Telos, so it must be around, I think it's like 295 or something of the German text, right? He writes, the same theoretical tools which allowed Adorno this insight into the social totality also prevented him from seeing the historical possibilities of a liberating praxis. Where does that come from? Is that just a question of, is that just a question of then personality, which is what Krahl doesn't want to talk about when he gives his personal statement, right? This isn't about personalities. He gives his political statement in that passage, which is also in the Constitution and Class Structure, and was in the Viewpoint magazine excerpt there, his personal statement at the trial. Fascinating personal statement. He wants to emphasize this isn't about personality.
But then talking about his own personality all the time.
Yeah. Well, or his transition, his personal transformation, right? Which, in a way, he's suggesting Adorno wasn't able to do because of the trauma of fascism, right? Now, okay, maybe too much psychologization here, but the question boils down to, how is it that Krahl ends up having this optimism of the will in the face of pessimism of the intellect, right? It's not inherent to unresolved contradictions. There's almost something more there.
So I also was struck by the element of psychologization here. So Krahl is also a Freudian, a Freud reader, of course, like all of them. But it's very strong, and I was struck by a passage that also has the same trauma topic, where he talks about the repressive anxiety, regressive Angst.
Yes.
That Adorno is haunted by when he thinks about the masses acting. And this, for us, Bernard, also is an interesting trope, which also plays an important role in French philosophy, that the crainte des masses is something like a hidden motif in most of Western political thought, that the masses, the multitude in Spinoza language or in Hobbesianese, is also always to be feared, and is also to be abhorred and to be tamed and kept in check. And Krahl seems to say, even the Marxist Adorno doesn't trust the masses, because he has, of course, experienced that once they were after him and all the others. And therefore, this also break in a leftist consciousness that came with the working class betraying, let's say, the Jews and all the other oppressed groups within the Nazi system, is something that he never got over. And therefore he was trusting maybe more the education and maybe the American restabilization of German democracy more than, let's say, the German demos and the German culture itself after the war. And he seems to say, if you're stuck in this skepticism or trauma, you will never think transformative action on a collective plane. And he seems to say this is why Adorno remained an individualist thinker. So let's say for historical experiences, because he had seen that this one collective actor, namely the proletariat, was not only not the motor of transformation, but even, let's say, the site of the worst developments you could imagine. And he seems to say, critical theory at the time, 69, this is an obituary written on after Adorno had died, one has to recover a sense of collective action and collective agents that is not fascistic. And that's an interesting thought that might, in a way, go beyond a couple of things that some of the thinkers at that time might have thought you could never think of. And for me, I also said it in my opening remarks, this also opens something like the question of, let's say, radical democracy within leftist thought. And it's not for nothing, no coincidence, that Adorno's thinking contains no democratic element in the strong sense. It has many, many, let's say, progressive, liberatory, emancipatory moments, but democracy is not the name for emancipation. Whereas in theoretical developments, let's say from the 1980s onwards, emancipation was thought through democratization. And for me, Krahl, in a way, had that thought. He didn't use the term democracy that much, but anti-authoritarian Marxism for me is prefiguring, let's say, post-foundational radical democratic thought. And you also were alluding to that. On that moment, Krahl and Habermas were not so different, even if they had, let's say, completely different registers in which to formulate that thought. But I would like these moments of attacking Adorno for not thinking democratic popular action in a progressive vein also means pointing to the fact that with Adorno, you might not be able to think democratic renewal, democratic transformation, and even democratic revolution. And this for me also is a fascinating, let's say, mischance, because we don't know if Krahl would have pursued that line of thought or not. But this is something that also already occurs within, let's say, mid-critical theory. And that ties in for me with many, many developments, let's say, of the last decade, in which this convergence between a certain conception of democracy and a certain critique of society becomes more pressing, urgent, and visible.
Yeah, I mean, another way, and then maybe Herman, you might want to jump in, and then we should open it up to everyone in the room and everyone on Zoom. Another way to think about some of these tensions is the tension that you see in terms of the fear of counter-revolution, which is another way of talking about the same thing. But you see it very much in Krahl's interpretation of Adorno, right? What was most worrisome about the student movement was the way in which it could trigger a counter-revolution. And you see that same theme actually in his critique of the reformers in Prague, right? The reform group who made the same argument that people shouldn't resist the Russian invasion because that would trigger even worse bloody, this is on page 4 of our text on Czechoslovakia. At the bottom of page 4, he talks about how, you know, the reform group ceaselessly called to act with prudence to preserve order out of the danger of bloody suppression of any angry insurrection. They function to prevent the population from forming autonomous organs of resistance. In part, and so I don't know if that also ties somehow to notions of compromise. It's a kind of like you compromise out of fear of counter-revolution in a way. That was a critique of Adorno. It was a critique of the Prague Spring, and it's also this critique, I take it, that's leveled then at the Soviet Union in terms of kind of the realpolitik, the idea of compromise, the idea that there wouldn't be a way of moving forward, which then paralyzes everyone. Herman, though, I saw you were taking notes and wanted to jump in on this, and then after that, we're going to open it up.
On the orbitory speech of Krahl, it was a situation where many people from the Frankfurt SDS wanted to join this ceremony in order to use it as a basis for some protest activities, against Adorno, refusing practice, and having also plead against certain activism of the movement. And in this situation, as I was told, Krahl promised to fight physically against everybody who wanted to disturb the ceremony. And I read it as a defense of Adorno. Habermas says, well, that's this pupil who cries after the teacher who is dead, now some infamous words. No, I read it the other way around. He insists on that Adorno is giving extremely valuable insights into the nature of society and also the internal dialectics of efforts of emancipation, because they have also opposing effects. And Krahl could explain it also with respect to certain passages or quotes from negative dialectics. And well, he tries to say that, well, the limits of Adorno must be explained by biographical experiences. Well, there is one Adorno who is still necessary for thinking, and there's another Adorno who has certain limits that can be understood as limits imposed by historical experiences. And well, Krahl says, well, those are limits we have to overcome, but at the same time, he tries to find some legitimate place for this reluctance of Adorno vis-a-vis activism and radical engagement. And I think, well, it's he does not use a systematic argument against Adorno, more as a psychological explanation in order to maintain some fidelity towards the overall philosophy of Adorno. Well, that would be my reading.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So now I see Shayla Ben Habib is on the Zoom and Susan Buck-Morse. Hi. And Marcus Wolf. And so we're going to go to gallery view, although just for technical, we don't have as much control over this. So you all are going to see each other much better than we are going to see you. But we hear you well. And Susan Buck-Morse has a question, and Sarah Bianchi here in the room, as well as Joel Whitebook I just saw. Shayla might, is that a hand? Yes, I see. Okay, so let's start Susan first, and then Sarah. Go ahead, Susan.
Yes, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion, and it's really nice to have this happen. I do want to say that I thought it was provocative and also extremely enlightening to put Angela Davis's experiences into this conversation. And I don't think enough justice has been done to that juxtaposition, because Angela has always been an activist. And sometimes that's meant she's been in jail. And other times that's meant she's run for vice president on the Communist Party ticket in the United States. And other times that's meant that she's been a reformist who at least got the California public schools to feed kids a hot meal every day in public schools. And I think that the idea of contradiction plays a role here, because it means that any kind of praxis that we do is not going to be pure. And we have to live with the fact that that praxis may succeed in ways that are far short of the radicality of our ideas, but that we're willing literally to live that contradiction, not to live thinking about that contradiction. And for that reason, I think that Davis is an interesting place to go to think the problem of Hans-Jürgen Krahl in today's context.
Thanks.
Question so much as a comment.
Thanks so much. No, thanks so much, Susan. Yeah, no, I think, it's not only because of the constant way in which Angela Davis herself is thinking about critique and praxis, right? And then also engaging in extraordinary forms of praxis and inventing new ones, and in a way inventing a new method and critical approach, which we're actually going to be talking about at the last 1313 with Sarah Haley on abolition feminism. So, and because of her connections here, but also because it does tie back to that question of how to deal with contradiction in a way, I think. I think that's really insightful, and thanks for bringing up all of the different modes of praxis, Susan, that Angela Davis has engaged in. She, in that interview, she traces kind of like the way in which it pushed her to join different critical spaces in praxis, including, organizations that where are these organizations today? The Che Lumumba Club in Los Angeles, right? But yeah, and then to move from one to the other, to the Black Panthers, and then ultimately now to abolition feminism. Let's add a few more voices and then bring it back here. Sarah Bianchi, and then we'll go to Shayla, and then Joel, and I see James Gordon Finlayson has his hand up too. You can take your mask off. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
And I've got a question concerning, or that goes back to earlier seminars that we had here in the 1313 series on Marcuse, and there was always the question, from where does the revolutionary subject come? And when I read the text from Krahl on the political contradictions in Adorno's critical theory, yeah, I mean, I was surprised that he makes such a split between the Adorno of the minima moralia and then the Adorno of the negative dialectics. And my question would be whether does not one need an understanding of certain negative dialectics to grasp where or how to shape the revolutionary subject? Because, I mean, for us, it is totally clear that it would be illusionary to think that the working class is the revolutionary subject, or something like that, so that we need a dialectical stand toward, or attitude toward, how to understand what that could be a radical change.
Thank you, Sarah.
Let's take
some more.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then we'll bring in that in the conversation. Shayla, thanks for joining us. Great to see you across the pond.
Frankfurt. You wouldn't think I would miss this. I teach this afternoon, but I couldn't resist it. And hello, Herman. So we were in the institute together. I have so much to say that, and I'm trying to gather my thoughts and be to the point, because there are a lot of people who want to intervene, but you can imagine that this conversation is part of one's biography and not only just one's philosophy. I guess what is happening here is a kind of revisionist, an attempt at a revisionist history of the Frankfurt School that goes from Horkheimer and Adorno, not to Habermas and Klaus Offe and Oskar Necht, but goes to HansJrgen Krahl, maybe Angela Davis, maybe the Pat Smiths, and so on. Okay, I may have some bones to pick with that, but I want to first state that I have a feeling that this is the elephant in the room that is not being acknowledged. Now, I want to add a few things to this. One is that the question of radical democracy and emancipatory praxis came up a couple of times, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit seems to be nowhere in this conversation. And I would say that Daniel Cohn-Bendit is a more important link, for me at least personally, between a certain legacy of the Frankfurt School in this period, a kind of resistance of European politics, the march through the institutions, and that ultimately opens itself to the question of not only gender, but also multiculturalism. And as you know, Daniel Cohn-Bendit's parents were emigres in Paris, who were also good friends of Hannah Arendt, and Arendt truly admired Daniel Cohn-Bendit as a political leader. So there was also another connection there. The second point, I think that HansJrgen Krahl and his reflections on Marxism, which both of you have pointed out several times, are orthodox Marxists, were to some extent coincé. They were cornered because of the presence of East Germany. I think it was very difficult to find a path in this period that was anti-communist on the one hand, and that wanted to retrieve a kind of Marxism on the other hand. And I think what is being neglected. And this is my last point, which ties in to what we are experiencing again today in Europe, war after 80 years, is the question of the link to the Praxis school and the democratic socialist critique of existing communism. As you know, Marcuse, Lukács, and Korsch met every summer. And I forget now which island it was, maybe Joel remembers.
Portugal.
Right, Cortula. And out of the Praxis of the Cortula school emerged the journal, Praxis and Constellations, etc. Now, there can be no anti-authoritarian left that does not found the proper language for critiquing Soviet communism and its authoritarian manifestations. This, for me, is one of the most important dividing lines between a certain naivete that I find today among young so-called Marxists, both in New York and in other places. I think there is a very valuable tradition of a critical Marxism that learned how to do this. And you have to bring that into the conversation as well, because what is radical democracy without a critique of centralized authoritarianism? How can we have radical democracy that identifies socialism with the state ownership of the means of production? I think that nobody in the panel really suggested that, but this is missing. I do not like Krahl's equivocations about Prague Spring. There was no equivocation about Prague Spring. And at one point he says, oh, isn't it interesting that the working class now wants civil and political liberties, like the rights of association, like the rights of free speech? And I felt like saying, bitte schön, this is ridiculous. These are the essence of any socialist democratic opposition. And why do we not just say, oh, in the Prague Spring, the Czechoslovak working class took a step back towards bourgeois liberties? No. For me, there is no lesson to be learned there. I think that had he lived, probably it would have been a different argument, but I think that we should be careful not to romanticize this. And I do apologize if I went on a little too long, but as I said, this is part biography and not only theory.
Thank you, Shayla. That was wonderful. And I do want to drop one footnote about the elephant in the room, and before we go to Joel, unless there's an urge for others to intervene. But yeah, so I mean, of course, the question of tracing different genealogies is particularly interesting here. There is, in part, you're right. I mean, the whole way of thinking about this, we were in terms of thinking about, in the context of Revolution 1313, the contrast between worldly philosophers, which I know we've gone back and forth, versus more university-based critical thought. Krahl becomes an interesting figure here as someone who might fit in a category of more militant, activist philosopher. And so there is that possibility of a trajectory. Of course, there is the other way in which the Frankfurt School can be imagined, which was Oscar Negd going to Hanover, right, with Detlef Clausen and others, and that being the actual continuation of the Frankfurt School. And there's a fascinating discussion of that in the Clausen interview. Fonda will throw it in the chat, I'm sure. It's the Clausen interview with, with Jordi Maizo, where he goes over that trajectory as well. So, I mean, there are different ways in which we imagine still today the directions that the critical theory took, one of which goes to Hanover. And of course, the one I'm throwing out, which goes to, Angela Davis, of course, Angela Davis does not need the Frankfurt School. So, and I don't want to in any way be kind of appropriating anybody's cachet. But of course, that is a provocation, though, to think about another direction that it could have gone in. But yeah, that is, I think that's explicitly on the table. It's not an 800-pound elephant that we're not talking about. I think that is the topic of the discussion in part. But Joel, you've been waiting patiently.
Okay. Well, as somebody who was on the steering committee of SDS in Berkeley in the 60s and witnessed the self-destruction of the New Left, and was also on the editorial board of Telos, these questions for me, like they do for Shayla, resonate very deeply with my life history. So there's a lot I could say, but I'll try and be restrained and limited to several points. The first ones are directed to my old friend Martin, and the last one is to Bernard. First of all, this discussion about whether there was a revolutionary moment at in 68. And can you hang on one second? My puppy is scratching at the door. I'm sorry.
There's the puppy. I think we heard the puppy a few times. Come on in. Come on in.
If I didn't do that, she starts barking and disrupt the whole meeting. So, Adorno is arguing for not having some sort of radical action. You could see it as being based on the theory of the totally administered world, or as being based on the theory of one-dimensional society, which we all know are problematic or have their problematic aspects. But there, I think, is another more realistic evaluation to be made, namely that it wasn't a revolutionary moment. Adorno said that, Marcuse said that, and the idea that revolutionary praxis was appropriate then was completely misguided. So it wasn't because of the totally administered world perspective, but of a very realistic political evaluation of the moment, namely that it wasn't revolutionary. And those of us who were swept up in the events in Berkeley as well as in Frankfurt believed that it was, and that got us into a lot of trouble. The second point I'd like to make is, and by the way, Marcuse himself explicitly said it wasn't the revolutionary moment. The next point I'd like to make, Martin, when you discussed the debate at the time, it seems to me that it was still based on the assumption that the working class was or could be an agent of revolutionary change, that it might not be the agent of revolutionary change in itself, but under the right circumstances, it could become an agent of revolutionary change for itself. Well, I'm not sure, I mean, the whole debate in a way becomes undermined when you reject this assumption. I mean, as we know, the question of the agent of social change plagued the Frankfurt School, plagued the New Left, and nobody had a good answer for it. But to hang on to the idea that the working class was still potentially a revolutionary agent, I think was an incorrect assumption. Now, Martin, you raised the question, you raised the organizational question. And, this is a question that goes way back to the Russian Revolution, the debate between the anarchists and the Leninists. And it was a debate that went on in the 60s. And Shayla alluded to this when she mentioned Cohn-Bendit, but there was another element of the left of that period who tried to address the organizational question directly and to try and formulate an idea of an organization that could be effective but non-authoritarian at the same time. And even Arendt brought it up in her appendix to On Revolution. I'm thinking here of Castoriadis, Cohn-Bendit, Arendt, and even an old friend of mine, Murray Bookchin. So there was a a counter tradition that in many ways was sidelined by the Marxification of the New Left. And you raised the point, Martin, that while current radicals of your generation are suspicious of hierarchy and organization, the problem is that when you lack one, when you reject the idea of organization altogether, as for example, the Occupy people do, you can't be effective. And you should excuse me, Bernard, but I think the problem here goes back to Foucault in a way. The fact that he does. Yeah, it does. A lot of problems do, we have to be honest. The fact that he failed to distinguish between legitimate authority and authoritarianism, that he conflated the two, meant that authority as such became delegitimized within leftist culture. And that makes it impossible to discuss organizations which are non-authoritarian. Organization becomes authoritarian as such. Okay, my last point I'll address to Bernard. Bernard, I was made uncomfortable by your evocation of Mao and Ho and Che and Fidel at the beginning. I mean, it was reminiscent of a certain sort of third worldism, which I think played a very destructive role in the history of SDS and the New Left. I think a distinction, when they're evoked as revolutionary heroes and when their pathos is evoked, sure, it has a certain effect of mobilizing people. But I think a distinction has to be made, which we failed to make back then, and which continues not to be made today, which is this. On the one hand, there's no question that we have to support the anti-imperialist struggles, the anti-colonial struggles of the so-called underdeveloped world. It's our political and moral obligation. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that leftist radicals have to emulate their practices. After all, these were peasant wars of liberation that occurred in a completely different context than the advanced world. And to think that we should import their methods of struggle, the fact that we thought we should import their methods of struggle here was not just bonkers, but had very destructive consequences. You saw it most dramatically in something like the idea that we should bring the war home, or that we should form Marxist-Leninist cadres in the metropole that would support the people in the third world. And another distinction has to be made, and Adorno sort of alluded to it. Likewise, if we're interested in radical democracy, we have to, as Shayla said, we have to firmly criticize the authoritarianism of those movements and of those leaders, while, as I said, at the same time, opposing imperialism and colonialism. I'll stop there.
Great, Joel. Thanks so much for that. I have a few thoughts. Do you want to start, Martin, and then we want to bring in, I think, Marcus, James, and Basuli. So go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you. So this was a perfect display of what happens if you place Krahl in the middle of a conversation. Then all these different things come up, and all these different projections and also lineages. And all of you said is, I think, right. So these would be new constellations in which you might place this. And Sheila, you're right. So we are trying to tell a different story, a different history, but not, I think, so revisionism, yeah, is always, of course, what the others do, but pluralizing the historical trajectories and genealogies, this is what we're trying to do. And it, of course, could also mean that this is part of a lineage and a trajectory that's not leading anywhere good. That's true. So you could say from Krahl, the next step is either Cohn-Bendit or the RAF. And you could make a case for the problematic of that lineage, and also the question of violence in a way at one point has to come up, by the way. So it's true, it's not guaranteed that this is the most progressive moment in that school's multiple and diverse history. What I would like to fully endorse is the historical point that we have to think about post-war critical theory as a post or Cold War phenomenon. That's completely true. So the West German left was what it was, knowing that the country next door is socialist but authoritarian, and is knowing that much of the money for leftist politics comes from the Soviet Union, and that you want to establish some kind of progressive leftist stance, you have to have a position on, and a highly critical position on, the Soviet Union. And this is what also was troubling many, many Paris leftists and communists at the time. And for me, Krahl here also is a highly symptomatic, not unproblematic, but highly symptomatic figure. And also the history of the SDS is highly informative, I think, on that plane. And we also have to, so if in 50 years we historicize critical theory completely, we will think about this thoroughly as Cold War thinking. And that doesn't mean a bad or a good thing. It's just a realistic assessment of what this means to think from the left in the age of, let's say, systems confrontation or systems conflict. And that's incredibly important. And also as you mentioned, the Korčula and Yugoslav and Praxis school connection, this would be the next step one would have to take if we were really trying to work this through. And Joel, you're also right. So these are then the problems. If we buy into, and this is also Sarah's question, of course, if we buy into a diagnosis, there can be some liberatory, emancipatory potential in popular or working class action and consciousness. And for me, Krahl and many, many other 68ers were trying to think this against their mentors, against the disappointment and resignation of the older generation. This might have been futile or wrong, but it might have been a fire from which also the energy of 68 in a way was coming from. And this was somewhat indispensable, even if it was a complete diagnostic illusion. And if we could recover that fire or not, and what it means to have a proletariat or an analogous agent today, this of course is the hardest nut to crack for contemporary political theory. Yeah. But thank you a lot.
Yeah. Just a few quick thoughts. This conversation is so rich and it's going in so many different directions, but it's fascinating. Three, maybe quickly. On the question of violence, which you just brought up, Martin, there's a fascinating passage in the personal statement, in Krahl's personal statement, where he actually touches on the question of violence in a really interesting way. I thought it's on in the English version. It's kind of like on page 7 out of the 10 pages. So it's probably around 296 or 7. He's talking about the SDS as the only group that attempts to rationally discuss the fact that nonviolence in the society has always been an ideology, etc. But a very interesting discussion of kind of like the role of the courts. And whether, in fact, whether he says that the legality of bourgeois courts is no longer able to give itself legitimation, and then starts talking about notions, a different conception of violence, one which I think would be interesting to rethink, with not leading to, the Red Army faction or anything, but a more complicated notion of violence in its relationship to legal legitimation also. So that would be one thing. In terms of, Joel, you were saying in terms of like the impact or to import methods of struggle from from Che, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, etc. So I don't think that the question is to import those methods of struggle at all, but to have them in conversation, right? And that seems to me to be the interesting thing, to have them in conversation, to see what they contribute to the conversation, what they could contribute to the conversation, how we need to distinguish different contexts, and some of the contexts that you were distinguishing yourself. I see in Krahl's picking up those revolutionary actors an effort to try and tease something out of them. I tried to tease out of it this notion of non-compromise, which I think is an interesting idea to then work with. But it's something that it seems to me it was something that he was teasing out of those authors who weren't part of the ordinary conversation necessarily of critical theory at the time, possibly, although again, I wasn't there. So, maybe others could tell me. And then the third thing on Cohn-Bendit, there's just this fabulous passage in the Marcuse Adorno correspondence, which we read, where Marcuse is talking about the fact, he writes, he had a run-in with Cohn-Bendit. It was a lot of fun, actually, not only because he managed to force his speaking choir into silence and whatnot, but also shows that Cohn-Bendit methods are, this is on page 132, 133. So there's some interesting pieces there for us to pick up as well. Sorry. Okay. We've got, I think we're going to try and bring in 3 more voices, which, I mean, we're getting towards the close of our time, but I think Marcus, did you have your hand up? Are you still with us? Or I thought there was James, Basuli. Marcus, did you want to jump in?
No, I didn't have a question, but I think there was an interesting question by Ulla Wegner in the chat. If there could be more pertinent philosophical reasons for the renouncing of political action.
Thanks.
I don't know.
Basuli, did you want to jump in? You're muted. Can you unmute? Sorry.
Sorry. My question is related to both Joel Whitebrook's last point and to Bernard's point about bringing different revolutions into conversation with each other. Okay, here is the question. Given that individual trauma has been a site of reflection for Krahl, how has the experiential on the level of the individual intervened in the theorization of collective responsibilities in the Frankfurt School? Can you offer some sites of contradictions where personal experiences have contradictions that personal experiences have created, and how have those influenced critical turns of the Frankfurt School? I ask this because I grew up in India when my home state of West Bengal was under the Communist Party of India, and the Indian left never revised its dogmatic collective paradigm since the 1970s. I'm not saying that is at all the case with the Frankfurt School, but I would love to know how such difficult conjunctures were played out in the Frankfurt School. Thank you.
Thank you, Basuli. And maybe, so we've got a few questions that we received in the Q&A. I think Joy James, who was with us for the fascinating conversation on prison readings with Albert Woodfox, has posted a question in the chat, as well as James Gordon Finlayson. So, but, and we're running out of time. So let me try and just maybe bring their interventions in, and then I'll ask you to, okay. So Joy James asked, what is the distinction between the new left and militant blacks and imprisoned people who saw or see themselves as having links with the quote unquote external colonies? And so this is a question about Davis's trajectory, joining the Communist Party through the Che Lumumba Club. activists were deeply invested in study more than romanticism. The violence of COINTELPRO leveraged against Black radicals radicalized many. But what is the distinction between the New Left and militant Blacks and imprisoned persons who saw themselves as having links with external colonies? And then James Gordon Finlayson asks, not to look only at Krahl's subjective criticisms of Adorno, but also to complement that with the weightier insistence that the contradiction in Adorno's critical theory is objective. He writes, the problem of private abstinence from private was in no way the only issue involved in the controversy. This is from the writings. But Adorno's inability to confront the problem of organization points to an objective inadequacy in his theory, which nevertheless assumes social praxis as a central category in epistemology and social theory. So in other words, let's not just focus on the psychological trauma explanation. There's also a kind of more weighty theoretical objection in there as well. Okay, so we're already over time. But so maybe, Martin, a few final words in response to any of these questions and to the session as a whole. Herman, did you want to have some final? Okay, go ahead, Martin,
So
and then I'll
for
close up.
me, the most interesting effect of that discussion is the realm of possibilities that is opened up. Because also to the last questions, one would like to say, if we look at later critical theory, you can say that a couple of these issues are taken up, some of them maybe even resolved or responded to. And that to me seems right. So Krahl himself, come on, he died at 27, so he could not solve much. In a way, it was like a very sensible instrument, registering some of the really deep fissures and rifts and cracks of the historical moment that we call 68 or 69 for that matter. And one could say that leftist theory thereafter, in a way, was also trying to grapple with them, transform them into other theoretical machines, other forms of praxis. Don't forget, Cardinal Cohn-Bendit was at that time starting to work towards what later became a new leftist party, but it took 12 years if I count right. So all of these things in a way were then combining each other with new theoretical and historical and also material circumstances at the time. And singling out Krahl has, I think, methodologically an extremely interesting prismatic kind of function. It's not that we look to him for solutions of anything. I don't see any. But we see the crystallization of theoretical and political problems of the time, and therefore redrawing the lines and the trajectories also into the moment that we are inhabiting now as political subjects, but also as parts of a theoretical tradition. This opens up a couple of possibilities and alternatives that I really, really cherish, I have to say. And the big question, of course, is how much Marx and how orthodox the Marx that you inherit remains, and whether a leftist thought for the present can get rid of a couple of points of Erbschaften, of legacies of that tradition, and one of which could be believing in praxis, and that's what Krahl definitely did. And this is a provocation, a challenge, and a promise.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I think that's right. In other words, I think you're entirely right that, you know, there aren't solutions here, right? What there is, where are they? Yes, but what there is here, of course, is, I think, from a solutionist perspective, a somewhat different relationship between critique and praxis, ultimately, than the one that we're traditionally, conventionally used to. When we're engaged in these conversations, particularly as we have been engaged in conversations about Adorno and negative dialectics and the relation and the marginalia and all of the issues that we've been talking about for years now. In a way, bringing Krahl into the conversation the way we were able to do here, I think really opens it up in a way and provides an opportunity to think differently about the relationship between critique and praxis. And that has been particularly stimulating here for us. And certainly in part, it's because of its openness, and tragically the fact that Krahl passed away at the age of 27. And so what we are left with are these fragments, very provocative fragments and notes and a lot of thinking, but not necessarily solutions. But I think fragments that fragments that dangerously allow for a lot of projection, right? As we can kind of pick and find things that we want to see in particular places. But in any event, in terms of this particular Revolution 1313 series, I think that we almost with these debates, we're at the heart of kind of a case study of the kind of question that we've been asking all year, which is, you know, what is the relationship between militant or activist philosophers and more academic critical theorists? And I think this is a place where we actually can confront that question. It's almost one of the rare places. Not surprisingly, it's 68, 69, right? It's not surprisingly, because that was the question at the time. I don't know if I end up appearing to be anachronistic or romanticizing, but in a way, it's those questions that were so at the forefront in 68, 69 that I think need to be at the forefront today. So thank you. Thank you all. Thank you everyone on Zoom. Thanks Shayla and Susan and Joel and everyone for participating and for those extraordinary interventions. Thank you, Herman, for joining us. Thank you, Martin, for co-hosting us. It's been another extraordinary pleasure to think with you again. We will be back on Wednesday, April 20th, I think is the day, to think through Malcolm X with Brandon Terry from Harvard University. So that'll be an extraordinary conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks, Fonda Shen, and thank you, Louis, and everyone who made this possible. Good night.